thank you very much. It's a real pleasure to be here, so thank you for giving up your lunch hour, I believe, to come and hear me talk about my book. My name's Helen Scales. I'm a marine biologist, and just in case any of you are wondering, that is my real name. Scales, fish, marine biology, yes. And this is my book, Spirals in Time, The Secret Life and Curious Afterlife of Seashells. I want to tell you a little bit about why I wrote the book and tell you a few of the stories that go into it. Starting off, really the title, Spirals in Time, the Secret Life and Curious Afterlife of Seashells. In the review I got in the Guardian newspaper a few months ago, I made the mistake of reading below the line on the website version and looking at some of the comments people had written. And one person felt necessary to comment on the subtitle. The Secret Life and Curious Afterlife was clearly a clever title provided by the publisher, enforced on this kind of popular science book. It's the sort of title you have to have. Luckily, somebody else commented also, well, it just kind of tells you what the book's about. That's fine. But actually, it wasn't my publishers. It was my mum who came up with the title and the subtitle. And I'm really pleased she did, because it means she kind of got what the book was about. Like she, from me talking about it for ages and also making her read bits of it as it was going along, she clearly kind of got what it was that I was trying to do, even perhaps before I really realised. So yes, there's really two things I'm doing in the book. One is telling the story of the lives of the shell makers, the animals that make seashells. We all know those beautiful objects you find on a beach. Might have picked them up, taken them home. But where did they come from? How are they made? What happened in the lives of the creatures that left these shells behind? So I wanted to tell partly the story about the wonderful creatures, the mollusks that make seashells. Mollusks are really one of the most strange, smart, tough, ancient and successful groups of animals on the planet. We're talking about familiar creatures. Mollusks range from slugs and snails and squid and octopus to slightly stranger things you might not have heard of, things like Argonauts and sea butterflies and chitons and weird little things called selenogastras that live at the bottom of the sea and frankly just look like worms, but they are still mollusks. They are one of the most diverse groups of animals on the planet. Really, they're only beaten by the arthropods, another phylum. These are phyla that we're talking about, a kind of grouping within the animal kingdom. And the arthropods include all the insects. So they definitely win in terms of the largest number of species within a phyla. There's over 1 million species of insect alone, most of them are beetles. But mollusks come in like a good second place, frankly. And they are an incredibly strange bunch of animals that live all sorts of different lives. It's thought there could be about 50 to 100,000 species of mollusk alive today that we've described already. And we don't know for sure, because there's up until now there hasn't been a central catalogue to list all the names of all the mollusks that have been described scientifically. We're now doing that, so hopefully we will get a bit more of a grasp on just how diverse these animals are. But it's thought by some of the leading thinkers and scientists who work on mollusks that actually there could be more like 200,000 species, including ones we haven't discovered yet, including creatures like these guys. So these are all micromollusks. They were found in Papua New Guinea just last summer. They are all under 5 millimeters in size, so about the size of your little fingernail. And none of these have been described scientifically yet. They've just been found. They were found during an expedition led by a guy called Philippe Boucher from the Natural History Museum in Paris. And he basically spends his life going around the world, leading expeditions, trying to find as many mollusks as possible. People do this kind of thing. Scientists focus on a group and really try and figure out what's going on. These are all found around coral reefs. And they're just incredible creatures. I mean, these are types of mollusks, snails and clams that no one's ever seen before. I mean, look, there's a clam with pink tentacles, for goodness sake, and transparent shells so you can see the skin underneath is brightly coloured. But these particular animals, and plenty more that they find on these expeditions, remain kind of on a museum shelf undescribed. They're called orphan species because we lack the expertise to actually have people sit down and name individual species. We just don't know enough about this kind of diversity. So there's all this hidden side to the lives of mollusks. That was partly what I wanted to talk about in the book, was all the things that we don't yet know about this incredible group of animals, including the species that we haven't yet found. And Philippe, I spoke to him, and he's one of the people who really thinks there could be 200,000 species of mollusks, and he should know. He's looking for them. He's finding more and more all the time, even if all he's really doing is doing a head count. Like, this is something different. We don't know what it is yet. We don't know what it might contain. We don't know how it lives, what interesting things that these animals might be doing. And one of the things that really kind of amazed me while I was writing the book, right up until the point where my publishers were like, no, you have to stop now. You cannot put any more science into this book. There's so many new discoveries are coming out of the mollusk world that pretty much every week I'd be like, oh, there's another cool story I want to put in the book. Like the fact that limpets have the toughest teeth made out of the toughest known biological material. They've knocked spider silk off the perch, and they figured that actually, because these are the snails that clap themselves to rock and spend their lives scraping the rock with their teeth, they've evolved this incredibly strong material in their teeth. So I was like, that has to go in the book. Somewhere we have to get it in. And then I think actually just the last thing I did manage to get in the book, the last story, was about how cone snails, these are poisonous sea snails that live in the tropics. They are kind of notorious for having incredibly diverse and kind of complex toxins that they use to hunt all sorts of animals, including fish. And there are a few species that if they sting a human, they will actually kill them. Bit of an overkill, but there's reasons why we think they're such powerful hunters. So that they can actually, a tiny snail that slowly slides along the seabed has the ability to eat fast-moving fish, which is kind of incredible. And a new discovery just came out a few months before the book came out, that they in fact use insulin as part of their weaponry, so that the only animal we know that's kind of evolved this hormone so that it essentially knocks out its prey by giving it a dose of insulin so that their blood sugar levels drop and they faint, and they can then eat these fish. And that's just really cool. So there were lots of incredible, cool, amazing, mind-blowing discoveries coming out of the mollusk world. And that was a really big part of what I wanted to do in the book, was to capture this excitement of what we're discovering. And the applications of a lot of this science is kind of exciting too. The cone snail venoms that have been used to develop medicines, that have been used in biomedical research, the fact that razor clams, I don't know if you've ever seen the long, thin shells you might see on a beach, they burrow themselves in the sand, but they're much more efficient at doing it than just their muscles and the shape of, and the strength of their shell would suggest. Researchers have figured out that they actually have this clever technique of creating little pools of quicksand around them as they dig down, and it's an incredibly efficient way of burrowing. And this could lead to the next generation of underwater robots that can fix things to the seabed, even sort of undersea cables for the internet that could be being fixed down by these little robots inspired by razor clams. So there's tons of cool stuff about mollusks that I was trying to talk about in the book. And some of what I wanted to capture too were some of the big discoveries and some of the big questions that scientists have thought about when it comes to shells and mollusks over the years. And one of the big ones is the shape of their shells. How is it that shells are made? They've got many of them are beautiful spirals. I called my book Spirals in Time, I guess because I wanted to allure to the idea that these things have been around for a long time. And spiraling around. These calcium carbonate spirals have been around for probably for 500 million years. We think mollusks first evolved in the oceans about 500 million years ago. But how do they make their shells, and why are there so many different shapes? And then lots of great thinkers have put their mind to trying to work out what's the mathematics that lie behind shells and shell making. One of the simplest parts of a shell, of a mollusk spiraling shell, is the logarithmic spiral. A spiral that expands at a constant rate. It was René Descartes who came up with this idea of a log spiral. And if you cut through a chambered nautilus, which is this shell here, you get a pretty good approximation to that logarithmic spiral in 2 dimensions. And if you look at lots of different mollusks, many of the gastropods with the spiraling shells, the snails, as well as the nautiluses and various other, the bivalves too, clams and so on, they do still have spirals in their shells. We'll come to that. What about in 3 dimensions? That was the next big question that scientists were thinking about, mathematicians and philosophers wanted to figure out. How could you make a 3-dimensional shell? It's all very well to say you've got these 2 dimensions. The log spiral is really important, actually, because no matter how big or small it is, it's the same shape. And that is a key rule to making shells, is that if they're tiny or if they're huge, because they will stay the same shape. So mollusks keep their shells their whole lives, unlike crustaceans, the crabs and lobsters, which shed their shells and grow new ones. Mollusks keep the same ones and just grow them bigger and bigger. But they stay the same shape, even if they're tiny or huge. But how about 3 dimensions? So it was, at the turn of the 20th century, there was a guy called Darcy Wentworth Thompson who wrote a book called On Growth and Form. And he was really thinking about shapes in nature and how can mathematics describe the shapes of a splash or a deer's antler or indeed the shape of a 3-dimensional spiraling shell. And he came up with the idea that perhaps you create these 3D shells by spinning a 2-dimensional shape in 3 dimensions. So essentially what he's looking at is having like a central axis, I don't know how clear that picture is, around which maybe a circle, a flat circle spins around, and it can either do so in the same plane or it can drop down that axis. It can, the whirls of the shell can overlap each other or not, and perhaps it would only take 3, this is running away from me, I'm going to stop it. 3 or 4 simple rules to actually make all the different shells that you see in nature. So he came up with this idea, just a theoretical idea. He couldn't test it, all he had was paper and pencil. Could you make all of the shells we see in nature with 3 simple rules of this single circle spinning through 3 dimensions, how tall it gets along that axis, and how much those whirls overlap each other? These ideas were picked up 40 years later by a paleontologist called David Romp, who did something unusual for a paleontologist, certainly at the time. He used a computer and he took these equations from Thomson and he plugged them into a mainframe IBM 7090 computer. The sort of thing that was at the time, this was in the 60s, 50s and 60s, was intended to be used for designing aircraft and nuclear reactors, but I think he managed to get some downtime. He was at Johns Hopkins University in Maryland, and he used this computer to build shells and to see if these simple rules that Thomson had come up with, whether you really could make all the different shells that you see in 3 dimensions. And he did. I mean, the output he had from his computer work was all kind of 2D plots, which were then realised by an artist in 3 dimensions. But we can now have a look at kind of a mock-up of what the output of his model would have looked like. And I'm going to let that run. I think it's incredibly beautiful and mesmerising. So what we're doing here is just changing these parameters, the height, the expansion, the rate at which the shell flares open as well. And just by changing these 3 parameters, you do actually get an incredible diversity of shells emerging from those simple rules. This incredible, this diversity of shells can be explained through fairly simple mathematics. You get the clam from a spiraling shell. You wouldn't expect that, but it kind of pops up. And what Raup did was he created what's come to be known as the Museum of All Possible Shells, and populated by these shells created from these logarithms, these equations, and what seem to be all these different endless forms that you see in nature. But the really surprising thing he found was that the Museum of All Possible Shells actually isn't full of real shells. If you look at the shells that have actually evolved in the past through fossils and through what's alive today, there are lots of parts of this space. If you think about it as being this actual space with those 3 parameters on an X, Y, and Z axis, there are large parts of this space that aren't occupied, and those shells haven't evolved. And it's raised this question about this sort of theory called sort of theoretical morphospace, the possibilities of what organisms could be, what shapes they could be, and what they actually are, and why there's a difference between the 2. So evolution hasn't taken mollusks and shells to all the possibilities that these simple rules could lead to. Some of these shells just haven't existed. Raup pointed out that some of the ones he made in his computer wouldn't have worked. There are clams that wouldn't open. There are some that would just be kind of flimsy and they wouldn't be competitive. out there in the wild ocean and in places where mollusks live. But there are plenty of shells that seem to be perfectly good, and there seems no reason why they haven't evolved. And people have expanded this idea out now, and we've built museums of all possible fish and plants and all different types of organisms that you can look at their morphology and see what potential shapes they could be, and then compare that to what we actually see. And again, you see this sort of limit of what evolution has created, what evolution has thrown up, and what potentially could occur. And discussions are going on. Like there's division between some people who think that ultimately, yes, all these shells could and would evolve if the situation arose that shell would be well adapted to a particular condition. And there are others who think that actually maybe no, and that evolution, genetically, there isn't the material that would ever evolve these shells. It just would never happen. And the discussions go on. So that's one of the big questions I look into in a bit more detail in the book, of how shells evolve, why they're different shapes, and why we don't actually see all the potential shells that mathematics suggest could exist in the world. So that's the life part of the subtitle. There's also the afterlife. And this isn't the bit of the book where I talk about snail ghosts or any kind of belief in the afterlife. It's really just my desire to talk about how humans have used shells. So after the animals inside that make them have died and long gone, and they've left behind these empty shells, we do all sorts of things with them, and there's an incredible long history, pretty much to the dawn of humanity, that people have seen shells, they found them and put them to all sorts of uses, both practical and incredibly deep symbolism and meaning in seashells. I was really amazed researching the book at just how broad and how universal these beliefs in shells are. You know, they're symbols of sex and death and birth and power and money, and cultures all over the world, and even far, far from the ocean, have these incredibly strong beliefs in shells. So I wanted to tell some of those stories. And I partly wanted to try and reinstate some of the grandeur and some of the wonder and magnificence of shells in human lives. Because today, I think shells have kind of got more of a reputation for being fairly kind of, they're cheap throwaway trinkets, they're emblems of the ocean that we can buy from a seaside stall, or perhaps we can find them ourselves. We don't maybe pay them that much attention, and people make things like, there we go. That's the kind of thing people use shells for these days. We make things like this, and also this, which is true. This was I found this on sale on eBay. She's got lovely headdress on for like, oh dear, now it's running away again. So I basically just wanted to, what I wanted to do was tell stories of how people have used shells in the past in ways that are far more magnificent. So this guy here is about 7,000 years old. I don't know why this is running away from me. Stop. I'm going to just, hang on a second. I'm going to just do this a different way so it just stops going too quickly. Let's do that. So yeah, I wanted to tell stories of how people have used shells, not to make comedy vlogs, but oh no, it's still going fast. Oh well, never mind. So this is a grave found in Bulgaria. Please stop. And about 7,000 years old, time of they were called the Old Europeans. I don't know why. Does anyone know why it's doing that?
I think you've got auto advance on.
I've got auto advance. It doesn't matter, but it's a bit annoying. Can we do
Really
something
quickly,
else? Oh, I tell you what I can do. I can put up the.
use the PDF instead.
I use the PDF. Yeah. Thanks. Sorry about this. Okay. Back to you in a sec. Slideshow. Excellent. So, yes, stories of shells been used in human lives. That there's this incredibly rich history of the beliefs and symbolism of shells. So this chap is the leader of the Varna community. These guys lived in Europe about 7,000 years ago. Up until this point, when this was discovered in the 1970s, this grave in a city of the dead in Bulgaria, it was thought that the old Europeans were quite an egalitarian group and that they were mostly just nomadic farmers. There was no sign up until that point of any elites who were kind of in charge, and that society was fairly even and equal. And then they found a grave with a guy covered in gold and with all sorts of jewellery. including some very beautiful shell jewellery. And that's why I wanted to talk about this particular case. Around this guy's upper arm, you can see on one side he's got bangles, including a white one. And that's made from a shell called spondylus. It comes from a long way from this part. It doesn't come from the Black Sea, but from the Mediterranean. And there was this long-distance trade in these shells called spondylus that were carved into beautiful objects all the way across Europe up to Paris. And often what was done with them was they were carved into bangles that people wore. And I think there's even been studies to show that some of these bangles were put onto people's arms when they were children, and then they grew into them and couldn't take them off again. This particular one, though, is just really intriguing. So it was carved from this big shell, these big they're called spiny oysters. That's another name for these shells. In life, they're covered in spines, but cut them through and they've got this beautiful bright white shell. And then carved into a bangle, broke it, and then fixed it with gold plates. And that's what this guy's wearing. We don't know why they did that. There's various other remains that seem to have been deliberately broken of these shells, left in graves. So there's some significance behind this particular shell. It was always the same species that was being used. And then it just disappeared and they stopped being used. It was about 6,000 years ago, and that's it. No more spondylus. There was a parallel trade in spondylus shells in the Americas with the Aztecs and the Mayans. They were using spondylus shells for decorations and money. They were carving statuettes of humans, giving them to children, taking them to the tops of the highest mountains and leaving them there as human sacrifices. So there were all these incredible, significant stories about shells. So I tell some of those stories in the book, and hopefully kind of try to reinstate some of the sense of mystery and wonder about what shells are. And I think one of the reasons people value them so much is because they come from this dark, deep ocean where they're full of sea monsters and things we can't see, but these beautiful objects wash up on beaches, and people have always wondered where they come from and how they're made, and hold in them great meaning. So, now I've broken it entirely. Sorry. So it wasn't, the beliefs and the kind of symbolism and mysteries of shells haven't all just died out in the past. There's plenty of modern, thank you very much, sorry. There are still some modern stories and of shells filling that role of a mysterious objects surrounded by sort of significant beliefs and ideas. And I follow the story of one of them in the modern world today, of this stuff called sea silk. Silk from the sea. And lots of ancient stories have been told about this stuff called sea silk, which comes from a shell called the noble pen shell, which grows in the in the Mediterranean. They can grow to up to 1 metre tall. They look like giant mussels, just like a mussel that you would eat. They stand really tall. And this stuff called sea silk comes from the threads that they make to anchor themselves to the seabed. If you've ever eaten mussels or cooked them, blue mussels, you will probably had to de-beard them and yank out the fibres that they have. Same stuff. Only these shells have really big ones because they're bigger, and they have to use their byssus threads, which I'll come back to anchor themselves solidly and so they don't get swept away. Anyway, so there's lots of stories told about sea silk, also known as byssus. There are stories told of the ancient Egyptians buried their pharaohs wrapped in cloth made of sea silk. Henry VIII had a picnic with the King of France with his men all dressed in golden sea silk. The stories go on and on. There's stories in the Bible of sea silk, and a lot of people do still believe that this has a very ancient origin, maybe thousands of years ago. And I went to Sardinia to find and to meet the lady who calls herself the last maestro of sea silk. She says she's the only person left in the world who knows how to weave fabric and threads from this fibre, a lady called Chiara Vigo. There was a story in the BBC a couple of days ago about her. You might have seen it on the BBC website. Check it out. That gives one side of the story, which is interesting, about what she goes up to. And she has a museum of byssus, a byssus museum in a tiny island off Sardinia called San Cantioco, where she practices weaving. She shows people how this is done, and retells all these stories about byssus and sea silk going back into the Bible and beyond, thousands of years ago. But as I was researching and working on the book, I met and spent a lot of time with a few people who actually study sea silk and look at the academic side of it. And scholars have traced records of sea silk back in the literature, back into the past, and discovered that there's a big problem with this story that sea silk is such an ancient stuff. And really it comes down to a spelling mistake about, in the 15th century. A lot of talk about sea silk goes back to Aristotle's book on the history of animals, and he talks about pen shells and how they have these fibres coming out of them called byssus, and therefore sea silk comes from pen shells, and it's connected to this word byssus. But actually what the truth of it is that word byssus was never connected to pen shells when Aristotle originally wrote those books. It was a translation much later that mistranslated a word that means deep and depth, the word that leads us to things like abyss and bathysphere, so a word for deep. And what he was originally saying was that these shells grow in the deep water. Thank you. And that was that. That's why he used the word byssus. And a translation came along in Latin later on in the 15th century, shifted an accent from one word of, I think it was actually from the Greek, from one letter to another, and changed it from meaning deep to meaning fine cloth. And from then on, byssus was associated with fine cloths. And there is a word byssus that means linens and cottons and all sorts of fine fabrics, but not specifically. But once that translation kicked in, and it was a really popular translation of that book by Aristotle, everyone thought that byssus, whenever it was mentioned back in all of the old texts, refers to sea silk. And it doesn't. It just means fine cloth. So unfortunately, all this talk about sea silk being this ancient stuff, it doesn't really have any foundation. But no one really is listening to these scholars who are saying, have you actually looked and seen that there is this mistake, and we're actually telling stories that aren't true. But that doesn't stop a certain lady continuing to show people this, and that's fine. And I went to see her, and she was very pleasant, and she showed me what she was doing. But when I was in Sant'Antioco, I also met, that's a lump of raw byssus before it's been processed, as it's been pulled off the shell, and it's got little bits of seashell in it. And that previous shot is a piece of processed byssus, the sea silk, before she weaves it. I met these ladies who also weave sea silk. So Chiara is not the only one. She claims to be the maestro, but there are some other people who still do it. And these lovely ladies showed me the same process, how they card the fibres, how they spin them, and then use them to weave embroideries like this. And one of the problems is that the pen shells are now protected. They're a protected species because for various reasons they're not doing very well. They live in seagrass beds, which are suffering from things like climate change and habitat destruction. So they've been protected, and you're not allowed to actually take them. It's illegal to take these shells or to harm them in any way. Chiara claims that she has found a way of sustainably harvesting sea silk from shells by taking them up and snipping their threads and then putting them back. The problem is that she's so surrounded in secrecy in what she does that no one is allowed to go with her while she's doing this. And so I can't comment as to whether she's actually doing this sustainably or if she's up to something else, because she absolutely refused for me to go with her and see what she was up to. The other ladies, this is the picture of these two, these guys. These guys. Jessopina and Asuntina Pez were very open and said to me, we can't get hold of any more fibres, we can't do this new anymore. They had a little collection of it that their grandmother had given them, and they use it to show people like me who want to see how it's done. Mostly they just use other fibres these days and carry on with their traditional weavings, but not with sea silk. And occasionally a fisherman will find a dead shell and give it to them, and they have a bit more to use. But they're like, it's a thing of the past. We want to remember how it's done, but we can't pretend that we can still do it because these shells just aren't available. And I just got this I felt like when I was reporting on this story, this was not what I was expecting at all. I was just expecting to tell this simple story of this strange old fibre that's been here since the Bible, and kind of found I was getting sucked into this stranger story than I expected of things not being quite as they should seem. So it was really fun. So, how are we doing for time? Excellent. A question I often get asked by people, mostly kids, but then they always ask the best questions when I'm talking about shells and mollusks in my book, is what's my favourite shell and what's my favourite mollusk? So I tell them that's a really hard question. You do know that there might be 200,000 species. But okay, if you make me, I will tell you that my favourite is the Argonaut. I even have it on my t-shirts. That's how cool it is. There's a couple of reasons why I do genuinely think that Argonauts are brilliant, brilliant mollusks. Firstly, well, they are the only octopus that have shells. So octopus are the mollusks that generally have evolved life without a shell. They have a soft life. They have evolved other mechanisms to survive and to do incredibly well without having an external shell. But Argonauts still have shells. You can just about make out. So they're also called paper nautilus. They're not related to the chambered nautilus. They look a little bit like it. And they have this papery shell. And a little octopus lives inside. And they're very beautiful creatures. I've never seen one myself. They live in the open ocean and they're really hard to find. And you often really just find the shells washed up, but no living creature inside. And for a long time, the big question was, there were these kind of sort of gentlemanly arguments and debates among scientists in certainly the Victorian times about the truth behind Argonauts and whether or not they make their own shells or whether they steal them from some other animal that we haven't yet discovered. This was the likes of Richard Owen, the guy who set up the Natural History Museum. He was really keen to figure out whether Argonauts were shell makers or basically pirates that stole shells from other creatures. And there were just brilliant stories told in all sorts of, I think Aristotle told stories about this and about Argonauts. I think he started it all off actually by claiming to have seen Argonauts using their shells as little boats. So I haven't got one to show you, but they are quite hollow and light. And you can imagine that they would float along the surface of the sea. And he told stories of seeing these little octopus sitting inside in their shells and sticking two of their tentacles, which one of them you can see here, they do spread out into this wide membrane, which we'll come back to. But he reckoned that they put them in the air as sails, and they caught the breeze, and they drifted around in their little boats. Or other scientists claim to have seen Argonauts using their arms as rowing to row themselves along, again on the surface of the sea with their little boats. So. And the story gets told and told. If you read 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea by Jules Verne, he tells this story about how Professor Argonauts at one point pops up onto the Nautilus. Haha, there's the Nautilus, there's the name again. Actually, it's quite sweet. And he sees, they see a raft of Argonauts drifting past. It seems to go for about 5 minutes. And yeah, with their ears, they look like little ears, which their sails supposedly drifting along. And it's his butler at one point who points out, I don't know if you know the story of 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea and how it's Captain Nemo, who's this kind of crazy mariner who kidnaps the scientist and takes him around the world in the Nautilus, which is his submarine. And there is some scientific truth. A lot of the stuff that he writes about is what was the science at the time we knew about. That Jules Verne was. It was really a marine biology book, but kind of with a story, which is quite nice. And Professor Argonauts, the marine biologist's assistant, actually says, well, why didn't Captain Nemo call his ship the Argonaut? Because Argonauts, the octopus, can actually come all the way out of the shell, unlike a nautilus, which is like a snail. You couldn't take it out. It would immediately not be very well if you tried to pull a snail out of a shell. But the octopus can leave their shells, but they just choose not to. And Captain Nemo was kind of the same. He could leave his submarine, but he chooses not to. He lives forever beneath the waves, kind of in exile from humanity. So I thought that was quite nice. There was a point in the book where it's like, you should have called it the Argonaut, not the Nautilus. So this debate went on about do Argonauts make their shells or do they steal them? And the other reason why I really wanted to tell the story of Argonauts and why they're brilliant is because of this lady who finally cracked this question of the truth about Argonauts. Her name's Jean Villepreux Power. She was French and married a Sicilian. Sicilian. She went and lived in Sicily as a lady of leisure. She started off life as a poor in a little village in France, but ended up meeting this guy and getting married, and spent the rest of her life as a scientist, like basically as a lady of leisure, she decided that she wanted to go out and just explore the world. She explored Sicily. She did lots of studies of the animals of the island. She sounds a bit like a latter-day Gerald Durrell. She brought things to live in the house with her. There were pine martens running around. But one of the things she did, and she actually isn't very well remembered for, and why I wanted to write about her story, is that she pioneered some incredible marine biological studies and invented an aquarium tank for research. And she built this thing which kind of was just made of wood. It was an open box with wooden slats that let the seawater come through. And she would anchor it at the edge of the sea, and she would take Argonauts that fishermen would catch for her, and she would occasionally catch herself, and she'd place them in these observation chambers, and she conducted some really quite elaborate experiments on them to figure out, okay, do they make shells, or do they borrow them from something else, or do they parasitize another animal? And I give the details of the experiments in the book, and it's really brilliant ideas. Some of them are a bit cruel. You have to do things like break Argonaut shells and see if they can fix them, take their shells away. And she slowly built up this picture that really did convincingly show that Argonauts, yes, they do make their own shells. And in fact, it's the females that do. And the males were nowhere to be seen, but it was always the females she found were making these shells. And in fact, this the membrane that you see on the outside of the shell, that's what makes the shell. It's really different to the other mollusks, which have this thing called a mantle, which covers all of their body, and that's what makes the shell. Whereas they have modified the end of two tentacles, and it looks kind of silvery when you see them alive, and they can fix up patches in a shell if it's broken, and they also make the shell initially. They only ever make one shell, like the rest of the mollusks, and so if they're parted from their shell, they don't survive, which I guess is why they always hang on to them. So she started having ideas. Veal Pro Power did have ideas about where were the males, and she didn't quite get to the bottom of it. The females make these shells, they lay their eggs inside their shells and use them as a brood chamber. But where are the males? And it wasn't until much later it was discovered that the males are tiny, tiny small, and basically kind of parasitize the female. And they have one tentacle with a packet of sperm on the end, which they lob at her, and it sticks to her body. And she can collect a few of them and put them inside her shell and carry them around until she's ready to fertilise her eggs. So the males kind of have a rather different role in life than the female Argonauts. And still things we're finding out, new things about Argonauts. Recently, one guy in Australia found some live ones and discovered that they actually use their shells as a buoyancy aid, a bit like chambered nautiluses. They have air inside their shells, which they use to keep them floating underwater, so it's a bit easier for them to swim. And Argonauts do a similar thing. He saw them basically, if he emptied all the air out of their shells, they all would swim straight back to the surface, gulp in some air into their shell, and then swim back down until they were neutrally buoyant at the depth they wanted to live. So it kind of reduces their cost of swimming by having a bubble of air inside them. So it's like a kind of underwater blimp, which is really cool. And leads me to my final thing I wanted to tell you about, which takes me back to the title of the book, and also I wanted to tell you a little bit about the artwork, which I absolutely love, and really just so pleased with the way the book has come out and how it looks. And it all comes down to this picture of an Argonaut. It was around the time I was writing the Argonaut chapter that my publisher at Bloomsbury said that I really had to decide what I was going to call the book, because we had come up with another title, which early on we decided we didn't like. I was going to call it Snails, Tears and Thunderstones. And then everyone said, I don't know what thunderstones are, and what's this thing about snails, tears? I can explain later if you want, but anyway, we decided that was no good. But I was so obsessed with Argonauts when I was writing this chapter, and with all of the great stuff that she discovered, and all the silly stories. All I could see were Argonauts. That was my view in life. So I wanted to call the book Flight of the Argonauts, especially with this discovery of how they use air to help them swim underwater. And I was hunting around online for pictures of Argonauts, and I found this one. And it's by an illustrator called Aaron John Gregory. And I had a look at his websites, and not only did he sell t-shirts with these on, which was really cool, it turns out that he's in a band called Giant Squid. We got in touch. He lives in San Francisco, and we got in touch, and he'd just been on holiday to one of the islands off of California, and he'd found an Argonaut shell on the beach, and I was like, we have to have this guy. He's a marine biologist by training, and has just finished retraining as a fine artist. So he was as geeky as I am about all the marine creatures. So I was like, we have to have him to do the front cover artwork. So we're also looking for who we wanted to work with on that, as well as the title of the book at this time. So we got in touch with him, and I'm really pleased that he agreed kind of immediately to work with us, which was fantastic. And I don't think he quite knew what he was letting himself in for, because we were still undecided about the title, and I was still pushing for Flight of the Argonauts. So we were like, go and do us some Argonauts. So he did us some sketches. I'm going to show you some of the sketches that he sent us, as unseen before, so this is very exciting for anyone apart from me and my publisher. So first of all, he gave us some sort of tentacly Argonauty ones, and I think they're great, and I was really just so keen to have Flight of the Argonauts and Argonauts on the front cover. But no, we decided that no one would think that it wasn't a book about Argonauts, it's just a bit of it. So we had to think of a different title. And it was literally coming down to the last minute of like, can I just have another day to decide what the title's going to be? And I kept on coming up with ideas that weren't working. And then I went on holiday to Devon and spent a few days mucking around on the seashore and finding shells and having a nice time. And then Spirals in Time just popped up, and I thought, that'll do. And everyone else seemed to like it, so we stuck with Spirals in Time. And that actually meant for the cover that we then had a whole free reign of what we could put on the front cover of the book. I should say that I really appreciated having a chance to be involved in designing the front cover, because I don't think authors don't always have that opportunity. For my first book, I was just kind of told, here's your cover, whereas Bloomsbury were keen to have me involved, and it's been really fun to have to sort of be a part of the way it looks as well as the words inside. So I told Aaron, so the two things I wanted to have on the front cover were lots of different species of mollusk. I wanted to try and capture this idea of them being this incredibly diverse group. And I also want them to be alive. One thing, again, that I really want to do with the book is to show people that shells aren't just these boring dead things that, sit around doing nothing. They come from these incredible living creatures that live extraordinary lives. So I wanted living, diverse mollusks all over the cover. So the first sketch he came up with was this, which we liked. I think you can just make that out. There was loads and loads of mollusks. But Jim Martin, my editor, was like, no, too many mollusks. Cut it down. Too confusing. How about a spiral of mollusks? The title is Spiral in Time, so we could have a spiral. Brilliant idea. So we said, go and do us a spiral. So Aaron did us a couple of spiral sketches. Do you want it down the page, or do you want it coming out at you? Of course I wanted it coming out at me. We then sort of said, that's really pale, but we basically said, yeah, have a big spiral going across both covers. He did a pencil sketch. This for me was really interesting, because I don't know how art is done these days, but apparently what he did was he painted these in with ink and a paintbrush by hand, and then he coloured it in on a computer. So he used a tablet to do all the colouring in afterwards, after scanning in the inks. And then he came up with some colour options, and we decided which one we wanted, and ultimately that was what we went for, and I just love it. I think it's brilliant. Some of the other things he did there's an illustration at the beginning of each chapter, so I just want to quickly show you those. So he would give us, I would say, okay, the chapter about cone snails, we want a nice active cone snail catching a fish, and then he inked those in as well. Chapter about sea butterflies, these beautiful sea snails, microscopic animals that fly through the open ocean. Whole chapter about those. So he did us a beautiful image of sea butterflies. And then our ammonites, but actually that's the chapter with the Argonauts, and I talk also about the ancient extinct mollusks. And this is Parapasosia, the biggest ammonite that grew to like 3 meters across, and the little shark there is to give you scale. So he did some beautiful images, and then finally, I'm really pleased that the book, if you get the hardback, and if you do grab a copy, the end plates, I wanted this for my first book, but they said no, but I really wanted to have beautiful snails on the beginning and the end. So I said we wanted Wental trap snails because they've got these incredible complex shells. So Aaron did us a little sketch, and then that's what it looks like. So if you do have grab a copy of the hardback, you have snails about life size crawling over the front and back cover. So there you go. Thank you very much.